A very good morning and many thanks for keeping it NTV Uganda. My name is Romeo Busiku. Of course, I'm coming here with a pertinent conversation about citizens' engagement in fighting corruption amidst a shrinking civic space. Well, we're going to have this conversation with Namudu. Yes, we are going to be having this conversation with so many people from someone from ACTIONAID Uganda and another person from Transparency International. Massimo Nduru is a program manager, People's Actions to Democratic Governance, ACTIONAID Uganda, and we shall also be joined by David Chizito, the program manager, Transparency International. So here's the big deal. We need to do more to allow Ugandans, especially the citizens, to hold leaders accountable when it comes to corruption. Yes, and they derive their mandate from the Constitution. Article 17, Section 1 and 38 of the Constitution allows citizens of Uganda to participate in activities that put their leaders to account when it comes to corruption and so forth. But then we are also getting information that people in government have increased their corruption tendencies during this COVID-19 pandemic. 8 trillion shillings that was meant for COVID-19 is still missing and is still unaccounted for. So we'd like to know some of the modalities around that. And also, we've also noticed a shrinking civic space. Many NGOs are closing shop. You have the government accusing some of them of being in bed with the opposition, but the NGOs are saying that is simply not true. There are also more requirements like the 500,000 that is levied on NGOs yearly to pay by the NGOs. Some of them are saying they cannot afford that money. So corruption in its entirety. What is the role of the citizens? Where do they derive their mandate? Yes, like I said, Mercy Munduru is here. She's the program manager, People's Actions to Democratic Governance. David Chizito will be joining us later on. Thank you, Mercy, for joining us on NTV Uganda.
Thank you for having me.
All
I'm
right.
very honored to be here.
This is a really pertinent conversation we are having, but why is it important to engage the citizens when it comes to the fight against corruption? And secondly, where do they derive their mandate?
Thank you very much. And as you rightly put when you were opening, that first and foremost, the citizens derive this right from the Constitution, which is the mother law of this country. And in the promulgation of this Constitution, there was a very wide consultative process in all parts of Uganda. And at the end of the day, the framers of the Constitution rested power in the citizens to be able to assert themselves and form themselves as the government of Uganda. And actually what we call a government is the people. This power is centered around the people. So by virtue of that, citizens derive their right, first of all, to decide who leads them, but also to decide within which parameters they lead them. And even when they are leading them, citizens still hold within them the right to demand for accountability in terms of how the resources that are allocated are being utilized, but also they have to represent their interests to their political leaders or any other leaders who have articulately been described within the Constitution. I know most times when you talk about leaders, we restrict it to just political leaders. But if you look at the Constitution, there are very different levels of leadership. And the law within itself describes articulately well what the role of each leader is. And that being the case, the people that are being led are now within their rights to demand accountability. And that is a role that both the state and non-state actors have to take very seriously in terms of empowering citizens to know that that is their role and that it's within their rights to actually demand for accountability. But also because citizens pay taxes. So the resources that are allocated for service provision are actually as a result of the taxes that are paid by the citizens at different levels, whether in the private sector, whether people who are formally employed, different categories of citizens do pay taxes. And the expectation is that these taxes go into improving public service delivery. So if that is not happening, or if that is happening, citizens have a right to know, they have a right to question, and they have a right to challenge where they feel that the resources are being misappropriated, or where they feel they're not getting the kind of services that they deserve.
And the NGOs that have been helping the citizens hold the leaders to account have been closing shop largely in the country. Don't you think this is actually increasing the civic it's closing in on the civic space in the country, because these NGOs were doing the most when it comes to letting the people know the machinations of the election and so forth. But then so many have fallen off the wagon because the government is accusing them of being in bed with the opposition. Do you think this has, you know?
I think, first of all, the issue of the shrinking civic
Yes.
space, we need to look at civil society and what defines civil society. Civil society is really broad. It actually stretches beyond NGOs to even include sections of the private sector and ordinary citizens. So, for example, the media houses are civil society as well. But as we see, the way the civil society operates in Uganda, the civil society plays a complementary role to what the state does. So where there are gaps in terms of what the state is doing, where there are opportunities for civil society to collaborate with the government, civil society comes in to complement government at different levels. Part of it is empowerment of citizens at different levels. The civil societies that are working on women's empowerment, the civil society organizations that are working on transparency and accountability, the civil society organizations that are providing legal aid and they're focusing on legal education. There are those that are working in areas of natural resources and how, you know, that sector operates. There are those who are driven by, you know, economic justice and business related civil society organizations. At the end of the day, in their various capacities, what they're trying to do is to put backstops where there are gaps and where the government cannot adequately reach. That is why if you look at every part of this country, you will find the civil society organizations, especially NGOs that are operating in different parts of this country, trying to ensure that citizens realize their rights, that citizens are participating in governance, that citizens are holding their leaders accountable, that citizens are demanding for better public service provision. But of course, looking at our governance landscape broadly beyond civil society, we know that over the years there's been a pattern of shrinking civic space. It didn't start today. A couple of years ago, we've seen the trends changing. We've seen, for example, organizations raided before. We've seen organizational accounts and individual accounts of civil society actors being frozen before. We have seen in the media fraternity, we've seen also there's been, you know, a pattern of violence. There's been a pattern of you know, shrinking how their space in terms of how far they can go with their work as journalists, in terms of how much they can cover, and restricting them to a certain, you know, way of reporting and way of interacting with the citizenry. This is a broad issue. It doesn't just stop with NGOs. It stretches beyond different sectors. Ultimately, if civil society actors that are meant to complement the work of government are being restricted in terms of how far they can go to do their work, it has an impact in terms of information outflow, in terms of service provision. Like I said, there are organizations that actually provide services. For example, legal aid, the organizations that provide legal aid, the
Even
organizations that do voter education right now, they've been doing capacity building. Organizations like the Uganda Women's Network has been working towards ensuring that women are participating in democracy, because we know, due to, you know, the patriarchal norms that exist in our societies, many women do not have an opportunity to participate. They do not even have the courage to participate. But there are those who have been brave enough to, you know, launch themselves into the leadership sector. So what these organizations have been trying to do is to prepare them as they get into this space. But
Mercy, are you worried that as we age closer to January 14th, more Ugandans might be unaware of what is happening, or might not even be getting the political messages that they need, simply because of the absence of these NGOs, which have been doing the most when it comes to voter education? We might end up with people who don't even know what messages there are from their favorite presidential candidates.
That is partly the problem, and that is a worrying trend. One is we need to accept that we're having elections in a very unprecedented time. We are battling COVID-19, which is you know, spreading very fast. At the same time, we are also in an electoral period, which is very sensitive. So we are at crossroads between ensuring that we're protecting the lives of citizens, but also ensuring that citizens actually participate in the electoral process. It is again a benchmark of, you know, good governance that citizens have to participate in electoral democracy. But what we're seeing happening is that because of, for example, COVID-19, there is a limitation in terms of how many citizens can participate actively, say in campaign-related activities, or those that can actually attend campaign rallies of their preferred candidates. There is also a limitation in terms of how many citizens can access social media, how many can watch TV, how many listen to radios. So most of the information right now is passed through electronic media. But how many Ugandans are able to access this? How many Ugandans are able to understand what is happening right now? So like you said, of course I am afraid that also with the shrinking civic space, especially for NGOs that have been doing a lot of work on electoral democracy, there is a huge gap that is being created in terms of information that is very important for Ugandans to have before we go to the polls in January 14th.
Massimo Ndulu, thank you very much. We also do have David Chizito. He's the programs manager at Transparency International Uganda. So we also do understand that the politics in the political cycle has been heavily commercialized. We are seeing money being thrown left, right, and center. But then it seems like the central government, even the NRM party, they're not bothered about it. They feel like it's business as usual. I was talking to Dombo Emmanuel, the communications manager at the NRM, and he was saying this is business as usual, and we are not bothered about the money that is flowing in this political process, because if you have to do whatever you have to do to lower people on your side, even if you have to use money. But I want to know from you, Chizito, is this a form of corruption?
Of course, it's corruption. Money in politics is definitely corruption, especially money that's not accounted for. And it's one of our businesses to make it business unusual instead of a business as usual. And this year's theme from Transparency International, if you look at the Corruption Perceptions Index, we were basically looking at money in politics and how we can reverse the cycle and the trends. And when you look at one of the worrying things in Uganda, you realize that we have weak campaign financing laws, and then our disclosure in terms of finance expenditure is still very low. And then most of our political candidates don't normally publicize their sources of campaign expenditure. So that's a very weak spot as a country, and we think over time we've been realizing more and more money coming into the political cycle, especially every time we draw towards a political process. And this time round, we've been hearing some corridor talks, of course, about COVID money ending up in political expenditure, which is not a good thing if you relate everything. If you relate everything towards the current situation we are in. We are seeing people moving with money bags like it's always been, and we are scared of what may happen come about January and the after effects of the election cycle.
Could it be the reason why government has been so tough on NGOs, because of such work that makes them look very, very, in a bad light?
I think government shouldn't have any reason or any alarm towards NGOs, because most of the work we do is to complement its efforts. And if you look at the budgets allocated to the Human Rights Commission, the agency that's mandated to do civic education amongst the citizens, it's too insignificant to do anything reasonable in a country like Uganda. So this is where we've been coming up with partners like SEDO to do campaigns such as Topowa, Honor Your Vote, and these other campaigns. So when government comes out to limit the civic space, of course, it's very worrying, and it doesn't stop with NGOs like Transparency International and ACTIONAID.
Of course.
It stretches way beyond that. What's happening in the media? We are seeing moves to close down space in Google and YouTube and all these things. Yet these are the major reporting channels that give people an opportunity to engage and to dialogue. So it's really worrying.
Go ahead.
So from us, among the efforts we are trying to do is to ensure that, of course, we try to bring on board some meaningful financing laws, but also we have several campaigns to sensitize citizens on the value of voter buying and vote selling. Of course, it's a problem, and we also have a challenge among the Ugandans that people are normalizing vote buying, which is really very, very
because
sad.
The leaders think it is okay.
No, the leaders may think
so it seems like the behavior is being propagated by the politicians and not the citizens.
Now it's two-way, because before even the leaders offer, now citizens are also demanding, which is a very bad precedence. We were launching our Uganda Bribery Index, and one of the things we realized is about 19% of the citizens actually offer a bribe before it's demanded for or before it's asked for. So you realize that it's a trend that's growing and growing and growing.
And even in your perception index, you also did mention that the judiciary and police are the second most corrupt in this country.
Yes, the judiciary and the police. But then the difference there is that if you look at the share of the bribe, the judiciary takes a higher percentage than the police. And the problem with police is that it interacts with people on a daily basis.
So what does that mean, Chizito? If the purveyors of justice are involved in corruption, where does that leave the citizens?
Of course, for us, we think active citizenry in reporting and participation will change the game. Because if you look at that domicile part of it, it doesn't take us anywhere. But when citizens are more active in demanding, it will take us somewhere. And recently, we just launched the Integrity Awards 2020 and realized that if we can bring more people of integrity on board, of course, and they participate more and more, realize that the trend will change because we are going into the preventive way of approach as opposed to this other way of chasing after the criminal and all that. We think if citizens actively participate, there will be a big change in Uganda.
Of course, the theme for this conversation is citizens' engagement in fighting corruption amidst the shrinking civic space. But then what are the factors that are stopping citizens from coming out to make noise about corruption? We'd like to know, Mercy, what are some of those impediments?
First and foremost is also it's an attitude issue. And this attitude issue is deeply entrenched. For example, you just mentioned rightly that citizens and politicians are normalizing, you know, issues of bribery. So right now, giving money, for example, to a traffic officer on the road when I've been stopped for a traffic offense seems a normal thing. People think corruption is more of when I swindle billions of money that is meant for public service. But even the smaller acts of, you know, giving small tokens of bribery to a traffic officer on the road is in itself corruption, because you are having a shortcut to doing the right thing. And that being the case, you realize that it becomes very hard for citizens to challenge the very same things that they are finding themselves normalizing. I'll give you an example. A politician right now who goes to the community to advance their agenda for the community without giving any money for people to come to that to such a gathering where they're going to perhaps present their agenda becomes less popular in certain instances than one that, you know, pays bribes to communities before they can come and attend their rally, or one that will send money around the night before an election. So that in itself makes it very hard for the same people that should be challenging these practices to do so. Second of all, as we mentioned earlier, you know, the sensitization aspect of it is lacking. We need to invest more in civic education. This is what, of course, civil society organizations are trying to do, but we can only do so much. It has to be a concerted effort between the state and also the non-state actors. It has to be something that has to be deliberate. It has to be, you know, widespread and in every corner of this country for people to understand why accountability and transparency is very important if we must achieve good governance. So having some of the organizations that are leading in this process going through what they're going through, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, we know the National NGO Forum and Uganda Women's Network have had their accounts frozen, and the media has been awash with stories of why and the letters that have been making rounds. Now, that in itself already takes away an arm that was trying to advance this agenda to the citizenry, because what we're trying to encourage is citizens taking lead on these initiatives. If I, from ActionAid, go and take a lead on issues of corruption, people will construe it to mean, you know, these are just NGOs, perhaps they're paid to do this work. But when I empower citizens to take lead on this.
Empowering a citizen, Mercy, is one thing, but then we are also getting information that people are being intimidated.
Exactly.
They are not coming out.
I was coming there.
Right.
Also because right now our political system or our governance system is marred with a lot of violence, a lot of intimidation, and a lot of high-handedness when it comes to people presenting alternative views. I must make it very clear, there is nothing wrong with citizens coming out to challenge the governance portfolio, because it is in their rights to do so. If citizens have to elect a leader of their choice and they want to express themselves in that regard, it is okay and it is within their rights, because the laws of this country empower them to do so. Unfortunately, the manner in which the state is relating with the citizens is quite intimidating for citizens to come out to challenge processes around them. Second of all, also, if you look at the reports, the recent reports that have been released with regards to bribery and corruption, most citizens do not trust in the systems that are meant to enforce, transparency, that are meant to ensure that there's access to justice.
But would you blame them if we are saying judiciary and police are the most corrupt in the country?
Definitely, I wouldn't blame them. But that is the problem. So if citizens don't have trust in the very systems that are meant to help them, that means that they will not see a reason why they should go and report a case. ActionAid has been running a campaign called I Paid a Bribe, a platform where citizens can report cases of bribery and they can be able to share the stories where they found themselves in a situation where they must pay a bribe. And I can tell you, in as far as going with the matter up to its logical conclusion is concerned, citizens are not interested. Somebody will report the matter, but they will not believe that they can actually access justice at the end of the day, or they cannot believe that there can be a transformation in that area. And that is why we have to do a lot to build the trust of citizens in the systems that are meant to enforce them. And also, we see selective justice when it comes to issues of corruption.
Right.
There are very many cases that go to the anti-corruption court, but how many of them are successfully concluded, and how many sentences, deterrent sentences, are passed so as to send a message to the citizenry about our deliberate will to challenge issues of corruption and accountability. Once we do not see any deterrent sentences being given out in cases of corruption, you realize that people do not see a reason why they should go and file matters in that regard. So we have to do a lot to build citizens' trust in the very systems that are meant to protect them. We must also create space, open space for citizens to engage with their leaders. We must empower citizens with information, with knowledge in terms of the provisions within the law that empower them to challenge corruption, to challenge undemocratic practices that exist in the communities, especially now in the electoral circle.
Indeed, Tizit, I think you have a submission you wanted to add on to that. But then before you do, I also have a question. Do you think government has done enough to engage the citizenry in this fight against corruption?
One, about government efforts, I think there are some small bits of efforts, but
you can start with what is lacking, with what is stopping citizens from coming out.
It's all interconnected. In
weakness in the witness protection law and so forth.
If you look at the witness protection law, of course, it's still lacking. Though we have the Whistleblowers Act that's meant to encourage more citizens to report on corruption. However, there is a weakness somewhere there. For example, how fast do we get the judgments? That's one of the deterrents. Then how fast do citizens get feedback on the reports they report on? Then the reporting channels are also a bit not very clear to the citizens. And then there have been information out there with so many and accountability agencies. Sometimes citizens are confused. Who do I report to and how do I follow up? It's still a challenge. Then when you look at the levels of trust, of course, it's also a big challenge. Citizens are always condemning the IG. They are always having an issue against one of these government agencies. Of course, it's a big challenge. Then when we look at back to the protection law, of course, we think it would be one of the game changers, because now we have the big fish syndrome, where citizens believe that there is nothing that can be done to them, and they fear that once we bring evidence against them, of course they may become the victims again. So with the witness protection law, it's supposed to be the game changer, that these witnesses who come out and sacrifice themselves to give substantial evidence, of course they'll have a way they'll be protected, and this will encourage them to report more and more. But we were having a conversation with one of the accountability agencies, and they are saying for them they have issues with, of course, financing. And if you need to protect a whistleblower, of course you have to do lots of issues, change their identity, change their locations, give them lots and lots of protection, which I think we don't have enough finances to do that. I may not say we don't, but it could be the willingness to fully finance some of these agencies. If you look at the Inspectorate of Government, the budget it has to run its investigations, realize it's very small budget. A regional office of the Inspectorate, for example, in Masaka, you realize it has less than 5 million to do investigations in the entire greater Masaka
So there is need
region.
to increase funding.
So funding is one of them, but if this funding is done, of course, it will do a lot of work with within encouraging more people, within bringing on board more cases and successes. Then the other thing is with the success, we saw something with the Kazinda case, and we think also the trend should change. Doing things of lifestyle audits, doing things of non-conviction-based prosecutions and asset recovery. We think in countries like Nigeria, where it has been implemented, it's working. And if we can do the same here, of course, we may bring more of the big fish to book. Yeah, then when we come to the other issue of why agencies are not doing enough, you realize that I think it could either be deliberate, because now we don't have the Inspectorate of Government, so at such a moment, we may not be able to take on new cases as an inspectorate unless these cases are taken on.
Well, of course, that is the biggest problem, because when I was doing my research, Aaron Miliagonja vacates the Inspectorate of Government office, that is in October of 2019. Up to now, the office is empty. Don't you think that is the major problem that we are dealing with?
It's a
nowhere
problem
to report.
It's a problem, so it leaves a big vacuum in the main agency that's supposed to fight corruption. And now you realize most of the corruption cases are now either being referred to other agencies like the DPP and all that. So this brings, or it leaves the mandate of the Inspectorate of Government in question. And that's one of the big challenges we have. And the main role is now being taken on by the Anti-Corruption Unit. But realize constitutionally, the Anti-Corruption Unit is also handicapped in one way or the other. So citizens are finding it more easier to work with CSOs, work with NGOs, as opposed to working with government agencies. And I think that's also a big problem, because for us, our mandate stops at awareness creation. It may stop at collecting some of these cases, but these are the agencies that have the real mandate to put into practice most of these cases that we report onto them. So there is still a big vacuum there.
And Mercy, what is the status of citizenry engagement when it comes to combating corruption amidst the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think the pandemic itself has been a challenge in terms of active citizens' participation across the spectrum. Also, that's because of the preventative measures that have been introduced that in a way limit how far citizens can go. As you know, right now we cannot have a lot of physical gatherings. Those are usually platforms where you're able to have conversations and dialogues. Those are spaces where you're able to have an interface between citizens and their leaders. Unfortunately, that has already been limited because we're battling a pandemic. At the same time, there are other processes, even as we battle this pandemic, such as the electoral circle. This being the case, you realize that there is very limited citizens' participation across the spectrum. Citizens are supposed to have alternatives to physical meetings if physical meetings are supposed to be limited. I'll give you an example. Citizens should be having access to media, whether it's mainstream media or social media, so that they acquire information and are aware of what is happening around them and are able to be part of the dialogues and conversations that are happening in these spaces. Unfortunately, not all Ugandans have the privilege to have access to the different media channels.
Or and even pay OTT.
Or even pay OTT, exactly. So, for example, right now, political candidates should be going to radio stations, for example, in areas where they can't be access to televisions, for people to be able to listen to the radio and get their manifesto and ask questions with regards to their agenda. But we've seen that there especially opposition candidates in general, have been denied access to media channels. Most of them cannot go to certain TV stations. Most of them cannot go to radio stations. There's a very limited time for them to be able to address physical rallies. So at the end of the day, you ask yourself, are citizens accessing the much needed information in the kind of unprecedented period that we are in? Second of all, we also know that a lot of citizens are afraid of the system that they're in. They would want to bring issues to light, for example, issues of accountability, issues of violence, and different forms of violations that they're experiencing as citizens. However, if you look at the representation of state response to citizens' concern or to alternative views, then citizens feel intimidated, they feel afraid, so they cannot approach the different agencies for help. Also, we know, especially when you are talking about corruption and issues of transparency, you mentioned the issue of the IG, but also we know that there's been a duplication in agencies. We have the government agencies, but we also know that there's an anti-corruption unit that sits in the president's office. They're all doing the same work. Where is the synergy? For an ordinary citizen, how do they front their issues to that agency? How do we give citizens adequate information about the role of the different agencies in fighting corruption, in promoting accountability? If that is not very clear, somebody may have very good evidence, but they will not be at liberty to bring it to light. They will not also know where to go, and they will not trust the kind of outcomes they are likely to get if they go to these agencies. So there's quite a lot that needs to be done, but also opening up, freeing up the space for other agencies, especially civil society. And by civil society, I don't just mean NGOs. I mean the different actors within the civil society sphere, whether it is the media, whether it is members from the private sector, whether it is artists and musicians and creatives, whether it is NGOs themselves. We should be able to allow coexistence so that we reduce on that intolerance that we see happening. What is happening now, I can tell you, is that there is a growing level of intolerance, meaning that people are sharply divided with regards to political opinion on different issues, which is a very bad trend, because that in itself is an indicator that violence can erupt if there are alternative views and if people are unable to tolerate these views in their spaces. And citizens learn these things from the system itself. So the ones that should lead on promoting a message of peace and tolerance should be the state, so that every citizen of Uganda is entitled to participating in this process in different levels, so that every citizen is able to feel that they are within their rights to participate in affairs of their country.
I couldn't agree more based on the facts that we've been seeing. Now, President Museveni is going to be in Mubende today. Posters of opposition candidates were in Mubende overnight, but by morning today, they were non-existent. It was only President Museveni within that jurisdiction. It has been happening wherever he goes. They make sure they remove all the opposition candidates and make sure it's only the incumbent President Museveni. So that's the political intolerance we are talking about. And Mr. Chizito, let's also bring in the issue of corruption among the government coffers. Have you noticed an uptick in corruption tendencies, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic? Government circles.
Yeah, we have several allegations. I think sometime back, Ugandans read a report in the papers where we had an allegation that the microfinance, one of the microfinance accounts, had been hacked into. And we've been seeing some things that circulate on media where you see the same banknote with the same codes running over and over again. But these are not new things. I think among the recommendations we made in the last presidential race or the general election, we were recommending that there should be some bit of separation of powers towards the election period, so that the level at which the government or public officers interact towards election period, that at least those wings should be cut off a bit. But if you leave the same powers as they were, we are seeing the same promises being made to citizens. For example, I've made the road, this is a separate mandate. It's not supposed to mix with the campaign expenditure. But back to the, of course, the corruption and all these things. For us, we are not seeing, every time we have these elections, of course, we see a lot of campaign expenditure. We see a lot of money coming into circulation. Of course, now you realize that we have more of the 50,000 banknotes circulating among the people. And if you look at the NRM campaign strategy currently, there is a budget in every district. There is a certain amount of money that's allocated to each constituency. And this is money that hasn't been, whose sources have not yet been disclosed. So as a Ugandan, of course, before we receive this money, we are supposed to question ourselves, one, where is all this money coming from? And that's a question that most of us don't normally interrogate. We just receive the money, use it, then come about 3 months after the elections. Of course, we see lots of things hiking up, and it's a general problem. Of course, we haven't done a separate study to do all this risk study, corruption risk assessment in most of the government's coffers, but I think one of the main areas that have been affected is the microfinance, and then these projects normally have the OWCs and all these things, because most of the money, of course, it finds its ways to the cadres that that support, of course, the current system, which I think is not correct. If you want to promote transparency, accountability, and fight corruption, you have to treat all Ugandans equally, regardless of their political affiliations, and it's a very current problem within not just Uganda, but most of African states. We have that sense of intolerance towards opposition. Yet these are people we should embrace if we really want to have a meaningful change in our country. It's still a way to go, but I think if we have an active citizenry, if we have people who have a conscious mind and who have the rights and are aware to ask the right questions, I think we shall get there.
David Chizito, Programs Manager, Transparency International. If you're just joining us, we are talking about promoting social accountability through an active citizenry. Remember, according to the Constitution, there is Article 17, Section 1 and 38 of the Constitution gives you the power to hold your leaders to account. If a road in your neighborhood is shoddy, yes, exactly, you can hold those leaders to account. Why is there shoddy work in my area? If you notice any corruption tendencies, you can rise up. Article 17, Section 1 and 38 gives you the power to do so. But we'd like to know, Massimo Nduru, is there enough political will from the government, well, according to your assessment as ACTIONAID in Uganda, to combat corruption? Is there enough political will, according to your assessments?
To a certain extent, but I cannot say the will is enough to combat it. That's why we're still seeing high levels of corruption. If there was will to combat corruption, we would see that demonstrated in the way we deal with corruption tendencies. We would see it in the way in which cases of corruption are handled. We would see it in the way in which our political leaders conduct themselves. But we see the opposite. The very proponents of the anti-corruption talk are the very ones that are dispensing money of huge amounts, especially in the electoral circle. So what does that mean? You cannot talk about corruption when you're not having elections, and then when it is an election, when it's an electoral period, you realize that you are the very ones that are fronting the agenda. So it is a two-way. Issues of corruption should be a full circle. During election, before elections, during elections, after, and in the entire governance circle. There is no particular period in which corruption should be tolerated and should not be tolerated. And it's very unfortunate that in our state infrastructure, we are not doing enough to ensure that we put backstops at every sector, at every government department to combat corruption. We are also not investing enough in the infrastructure that protects whistleblowers and witnesses and people that provide useful information that is meant to combat corruption. I will say, for example, we do not have safe shelters where if a witness is being threatened because they are part of a sensitive case, they can be kept and they can be protected until the process is managed. We do not have that. So that does not encourage reporting. Also, the mere fact that we have not done enough to empower the different agencies within government in terms of what are the good practices for fighting corruption. I know, for example, within the police, Uganda Police, we always have different layers of officers that deal with issues of corruption. Unfortunately, most of them lack the capacity to investigate cases of corruption. They also lack the capacity to follow up these matters to conclusion. Most of these officers come into the arena as typical police officers, and we know that corruption is very specialized in nature, and the way it is investigated is not the same way any other crime is investigated, because it's a very complex paradox. There are a lot of power dynamics that are involved, especially if you're investigating a corruption matter, and if you're not well facilitated, you will fall prey to the same corruption. I know very many officers who have confessed to me before that while investigating a corruption issue, they've been offered huge amounts of money to be able to either manipulate the case or back off the case or lose certain documents. And now if you look at how our police is facilitated, definitely they will be tempted to take the bribe so that they can survive. If my family doesn't have food for the following day, I will take the bribe instead of sticking to the values for which I stand. So that in itself makes it very hard for the agencies such as police to pursue matters to their logical conclusion. So for us to be able to address corruption ably, we must start by empowering the agencies themselves who are charged with the mandate to investigate and to ensure that cases of corruption are handled to their logical conclusion. Same thing I would say for the judiciary and all the other agencies as well, and the different agencies of government. So if you look at usually the allocations, the secretariat of most of these agencies may have a substantial amount of money, but as this money trickles down to the lowest level, the amount keeps shrinking. And if you look at the amounts that they have to work with to ensure that, you know, they're handling matters related to corruption, you find it is not reasonable. So it makes it extremely challenging even for them to be able to do that. I would think if we had political will, if I had to answer your question in affirmative, I would answer it very well if, first of all, I see the amount of budget allocated for agencies that are leading on the fight against corruption. So you will know government will based on government priorities. So what are our budgetary priorities? If our priority is fighting corruption, then ultimately we'll see that in the way allocations are done. We'll see that in the way agencies are empowered to do their work. That way, you'll be able to demand accountability for them, knowing that you've done your part as the state to give them the required budget to be able to, you know, undertake their mandate at different levels. So I don't think the will is.
And I was also talking to some people, and they were saying if there was a will from government, they would have removed OTT to allow more citizens to blow the whistle on the internet. But as it is they maintained OTT. Seems like they want the opposite. People not to talk about the problems in the country, especially corruption. Tizito David, when you talk about corruption, are we only talking about money in circulation or also the behavior of some people in power, selective application of the law? If some people are congregating from the NRM side and the police does nothing, and then the opposition is congregating and then they are, you know, swarming upon them, arresting them, saying they are flouting COVID-19 guidelines. Selective application of the law, is it a form of corruption?
Corruption is really broad, and some people choose to say most people are falling short of the glory. And when you look across the board, people, especially Ugandans, they may look at it at the angle of bribery, which is mainly the most common form of corruption. But people don't know that when you go to a health facility and you don't find a medical worker there, that's also corruption. They don't know that when their teacher comes late in a certain school facility, that's corruption. They don't know that abscondment of duty, misuse of power, and all these things, it's all corruption. And I think it's one of the things we need to actively continue engaging citizens on, to make them real aware about the different forms of corruption, so that they can really come out and, of course, engage. They can really come out and meaningfully participate in areas where we've been trying to do lots of citizens awareness, regions of Greater Masaka, and areas where we've been sensitizing and training community persons. You've been seeing a change, especially towards the services that people attain, medical, healthcare, education, and all this. There is some form of improvement, and if you compare it to regions where there are not any of these interventions, you really see that there is quite a difference. But when you come to the way state institutions conduct their business, that's again something some people call, I think, a human syndrome, one-man syndrome, or something like that, where people are now attaining service delivery to human figures, which is very, very wrong. Because the problem is, what will happen if this figure is not around? There is a mess, I think, that we are trying to create within a country. If you realize that
there is a problem, people will be like, Museveni should come and help.
Exactly. That's a very big problem. And if you rotate all your problems on just one man, it's really a challenge. So if you look at the security forces, you look at police, you look at the army, you look at the district commissioners and all these people that are supposed to serve the entire population, and they are shifting all their efforts towards one individual. It's really a big problem. Some of these things we may underlook them, but the impact and the effect they instill in the minds of the people, they are really huge, and you never know. It becomes more like a bomb. You never know. When it ticks, sometimes you just ignore it, but when it explodes, perhaps you may not like the consequences. And we think
a recent example is, you know, the pastors who were soliciting funds from people with promise that they would take them to meet the head of state. So people believe that some of their problems can only be solved by the head of state. So they're willing to even pay money to individuals to ensure that that happens.
Yeah,
And that in itself is corruption,
it's a
because
big problem.
because the part of corruption is extortion.
Right.
And in my opinion, that action was extortion of money, and it was huge sums of money, almost in billions. So that is the impact that I just wanted to mention. That
but the other
impact
major impact on that is we've realized the collapse of most of our systems.
Right.
When you look at everyone, they'll always complain this institution is not doing much, so and so is not doing much. Currently, we have allegations towards the Electoral Commission. Even the president himself came out and said negative comments about the chairperson of the EC. So if you have that individualism syndrome, of course, even your systems will cease to function, because each and every agency you go to, they'll say, what's the ask of the president? What is the president saying this? Is the president in agreement with what we need to say? And that's really dangerous, because now we don't have systems that will work anymore. You look at the COVID-19 response plans, you realize we have institutions that would have done emergency response. You have the Minister of Health, you have maybe the OPM could have played some role in it. Then you have Minister of Finance, of course it comes in handy. Then PPDA, of course it was supposed to overlook all the procurements. But then what happens? The first weeks of lockdown, PPDA also went into lockdown. It wasn't working. So all these procurements that happen, who is supposed to monitor them? No one, because the person mandated, or the agents mandated to monitor these procurements is under lockdown. You look at the Inspectorate of Government, most of these institutions came on board just after, and even civil society itself, it wasn't given a slot in the COVID-19 task force until we had to come out and book our space in. So there is that bit of, you know, create something here, then once money goes, you won't hold anyone accountable, then create another task force somewhere. And we saw most of these things happening in the initial NUSAF programs and all these other agencies of, you remember Chogam scandals. So if we have these ad hoc committees, institutions and systems are not working, of course, you leave a lot of blank spaces. You leave, it's like a basket, so that everything you put in will always be getting out. And that's the system we currently have in Uganda. You have so much funds you've borrowed for COVID, but then when you go to the medical facilities, you realize we don't have ICUs. People are dying, they don't access enough oxygens. They tell you in Mulago people are sleeping on the floors because the beds are not enough. Then you ask, where did all this money go? And you don't have an institution or an agency to put to task, because the one-man syndrome created task forces that are now disappearing. And that's a big problem, I think, in the fight. All
right, David Chizito and Massimo Nduru, let's get a hold of some recommendations. What are some of the resolutions? I know we mentioned some, but as challenges before that are stopping people from coming out to make noise about corruption. But then what are some of the resolutions we could come up with to engage the citizens in this fight against corruption and promoting social accountability in that regard? Marcy.
Thank you. I think I'll start with the recent initiative that we just concluded, both the Anti-Corruption Week and the Integrity Awards.
That's
that was
7th to 11th.
Yes, that was citizen-led. For me, those are very important initiatives to enable citizens to hold their leaders accountable, but also to acknowledge and to celebrate the contribution of citizens who are doing their part in ensuring that they serve with integrity, in ensuring that the resources that are located in their docket are very well utilized. I believe, much as we think that the situation is bad, I know there are so many people in public institutions who are doing work towards ensuring integrity. And when we celebrate and acknowledge them publicly, it gives hope to those who are getting into the leadership arena, to those who are already there, to rethink their ways of doing work, knowing very well that when they do well, they're encouraged. There is a syndrome where we usually put a lot of attention on the negatives and we don't celebrate the positives. So for me, initiatives like that are very important. As he rightfully put, that we should not just stop at prosecution, because punitive actions may be good, but they do not achieve the end. We should attach other prosecutory mechanisms in fighting corruption. So such as asset recovery, we should be able to audit lifestyle of public officials before even we get into prosecution, so that apart from sentencing somebody to so many years in prison, you are able to recover some of those resources back and put them to good use. I also think that we should continue to empower citizens, and the state should open up the space that it has shrinked for civil society partners at the different levels to ensure that citizens are participating in democracy. It is in their right to do so. And it will be the only way Ugandans will be able to feel like the part and parcel of the democratic process. It will also limit the avenues people want to use for violence. So because when the space is shrinked and people feel they cannot peacefully participate in a process, they will look for violent means of participating in the process because they feel they should be participating in that process. So I believe the more we create space for citizens to dialogue, for them to participate, the better for us as a country, the better for Ugandan citizens. And above all, we should continue to challenge institutions, especially agencies that are meant to tackle issues of corruption, to be transparent in the way they do their work. We should be able to get constant reports and updates about the efforts that they're making in fighting corruption. We should not wait a year for police to give us a report about corruption cases that they've been able to successfully investigate and where they are at. We should be able to have that as constantly as possible so that citizens can renew their trust in the system, so that citizens can believe that their systems are actually working for them. If the police and the judiciary are not constantly updating citizens about what they are doing, citizens will never trust the system because they will believe the system is not working for their own good. So we have to be as transparent as we can be with the citizens and empower them with information that is useful. Yeah.
David, is it recommendations Massimo Nduru might have missed?
On our side, we still emphasize the need for citizens to engage in the fight against corruption. And one of them is to report effectively as much as possible. But also there is that big need for citizens to participate in their governance processes. If there is a budgeting process going on in your community, are you part of it? If there is a road being constructed, are you getting enough detail about that road? We think it will change the game, but also we need to see more people loving their country more. And we shall thank a medical worker in Masindi. This year's overall winner of the Integrate Awards was just a mainstream grass. We call them foot soldier medical worker. She is a midwife in Masindi. But you know the way she conducts her business, it inspires others. And then the other person was a DEO, District Education Officer in Chotera. He produced one of the best teachers in the country. And we think if more of these people can come out as examples, it will inspire others. And the other thing, or the major missing link now, is also citizens to actively report cases of corruption. Of course, CSOs, we have provided lots of reporting channels. At Transparency, we have an anti-corruption call center. We always try as much as possible to disseminate it among the people. And it's a very simple number, 0800 333 044. 0800 333 044. So once they call on it, of course, we recommend that they give us cases with at least some bit of evidence that gives us a basis to follow up, because most of the people, sometimes they tend to report on issues of allegations, which is also wrong. You find that you have about 100 cases, but among those cases you have about only 5 substantial cases you can report on. So that's the other issue. Then we also want to see more of information being given to citizens. Of course, our IT infrastructure is still weak as a country, but we think we can do more. Citizens need to access more internet so that, you know, these are one of the easiest reporting channels, and I think internet should be made cheaper so that as they report, they can also be able to access information. If you look at the Ministry of Finance budget portal, it's online. So how many citizens in local communities can access this currently? It's still hard because we even failed to implement the radio education program. Yeah, that's one of the easiest. So we think we should have more of these extended to citizens to enhance their reporting on issues of corruption.
David Chizito is the Programs Manager at Transparency International, and Massimo Nduru is from ACTIONAID Uganda. Many thanks for having made the time to talk to us on NTV Uganda. Of course, the conversation has been largely centered around promoting social accountability through an active citizenry. Remember, the Constitution, Article 17, Section 1 and 38 of the Constitution empowers you, to hold your leaders to account when it comes to the these corruption tendencies. When there's a road that is being done shoddily, you have a right to stop it as a citizen. If you realize the medical center doesn't have any drugs, you have a right to make noise as a citizen. A school has no desks. You have a right to make noise in that regard because the Constitution gives you the power. My name is Romeo Busiku. Have yourselves a blessed day.